On May 21st, the United States government made an announcement that immediately sent shockwaves through financial markets on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. Within 2 trading days, Chinese quantum computing stocks surged nearly 20%. American quantum stocks did something even more dramatic, with one company jumping over 63% in just 48 hours. This wasn't a new invention. It wasn't a scientific breakthrough announced in a research journal. It was a funding decision, and yet it managed to rattle Beijing enough that analysts immediately started predicting China would accelerate its entire national quantum strategy in direct response. So what exactly did America do, and why did it hit China this hard? Let's break down what actually happened and why the shockwaves are still spreading through the global quantum race right now. Here's exactly what triggered this. The U.S. Department of Commerce announced letters of intent totaling $2.013 billion, distributed across 9 different American quantum companies, funded through the CHIPS and Science Act. This wasn't a research grant handed out and forgotten. 2 companies received funding specifically to build domestic manufacturing foundries. Global Foundries received $375 million to establish a domestic quantum foundry spanning multiple hardware approaches simultaneously. IBM received a full $1 billion to build an entirely new subsidiary dedicated to producing quantum-grade superconducting wafers on American soil. The remaining $538 million was split across 7 additional companies, including Atom Computing, D, Wave, Inflection, PsiQuantum, Quantinuum, and Rigetti, each receiving up to $100 million to solve specific unresolved engineering problems across different quantum hardware approaches. A smaller player called Dirac, focused on silicon spin qubits, received up to $38 million of its own. And crucially, in exchange for every single dollar, the U.S. government took a minority equity stake in each recipient company. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick didn't mince words about what this actually represented. He described it as leading the world into a new era of American innovation, explicitly framing these investments as building domestic industry, creating thousands of high-paying American jobs, and advancing national quantum capabilities all at once. But strip away the political framing for a moment and look purely at the financial mechanics involved, because that's genuinely where this story gets interesting. The U.S. government didn't just fund research. It became a literal shareholder in the companies racing to build America's quantum future, turning what used to be considered a purely speculative, venture capital-driven sector into something with an explicit government-backed floor underneath it. It's worth pausing here to explain why hardware manufacturing, specifically, rather than just research funding, represents such a meaningful shift in American strategy. For years, the United States led the world in quantum research output, publishing groundbreaking papers and demonstrating impressive laboratory results through universities and private companies. But research breakthroughs sitting in academic journals don't automatically translate into deployable national capability. Building actual quantum hardware at scale requires domestic foundries capable of producing specialized components like superconducting wafers, something America had increasingly outsourced or left fragmented across a handful of underfunded suppliers. By specifically funding IBM's new subsidiary and Global Foundries' Quantum Foundry, Washington wasn't just betting on more research. It was directly addressing the industrial bottleneck standing between promising lab results and a genuinely functioning domestic quantum manufacturing base, exactly the kind of gap policy analysts have been warning about for years. Markets reacted almost instantly and violently. Rigetti Computing jumped more than 63% across those same 2 trading days. D-Wave surged roughly 53%. Inflection soared over 30%. Even IBM, an established, diversified tech giant, still gained around 13% purely on the strength of this single announcement. For a sector where most companies still generate minimal revenue and post consistent losses, that kind of coordinated simultaneous surge across nearly every major player signals something important. Investors weren't just betting on individual company fundamentals anymore. They were betting on an entire government-backed industrial strategy suddenly locking into place all at once. China's response to this entire competition isn't purely about matching American funding dollar for dollar either. Chinese officials have recently signaled a meaningful shift in strategic emphasis, moving away from purely chasing raw technical milestones and toward actually commercializing quantum technology into products and services that generate real economic value. Guo Guoping, a member of China's National People's Congress and chief scientist at a major Chinese quantum company, has openly acknowledged what he called a disconnect between quantum technology and the market, admitting that China still lags behind in translating scientific advances into practical, widely adopted applications. His proposed solution involves government-led pilot projects across key industries like finance, drug discovery, and power systems, aiming to produce several widely recognized use cases by the middle of China's current 5-year planning period, ultimately building toward a nationwide quantum computing network by 2030. That shift matters, because it suggests China isn't simply racing to build the most impressive laboratory demonstration. It's racing to prove that quantum technology can actually deliver measurable economic returns before its rivals manage to do the same thing first. Here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because China's reaction wasn't just commentary from the sidelines, it showed up immediately in Chinese capital markets too. Quantum C-Tech, one of China's most prominent quantum communication companies, surged 19% to 641 yuan across the same 2 trading days. Guochuang Software gained nearly 18%. Coal Software rose 9.5%. Chinese investors weren't just watching America's announcement with academic interest. They were actively betting that Beijing would feel pressured to respond with its own accelerated push to keep pace in the global race for what analysts increasingly call quantum supremacy. In other words, the shock didn't stay contained within American borders. It rippled directly into Chinese trading floors within hours. Before we go any further, if this kind of global tech chess match genuinely fascinates you, do me a favor and hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, because we break down exactly these kinds of high-stakes international power plays every single week. To really understand why this particular announcement rattled China so specifically, you need to understand what China had already been building in the exact same weeks leading up to it. This wasn't China caught flat-footed after years of inaction. Quite the opposite. In the same month as America's funding announcement, Origin Quantum had just launched Origin Wukong 180, its 4th-generation superconducting quantum computer built on a genuinely impressive 180 qubit chip. The Chinese Academy of Sciences Cold Atom Technology Division had just unveiled what it described as the world's first dual-core quantum computer. The University of Science and Technology of China released Zhuzheng. It's likely to accelerate Beijing's existing timetable rather than trigger some entirely new strategy from scratch. Folding quantum cryptography and quantum computing capabilities under a single state-owned entity backed by more than 10 billion yuan in planned investment. China Telecoms. And materials design. And a third dimension tied directly to raw economic and technological supremacy in the coming decade. Here's where the competition gets structurally interesting. Because the United States and China are approaching this exact same race using fundamentally different playbooks. China's model is explicitly state-led and quantum satellite, the Beijing-Shanghai quantum communication backbone, and China's Zhujiang and Zhuchangji quantum computers all demonstrate the state's proven ability to scale coordinated research directly into massive national infrastructure. The United States, by contrast, has historically relied on a much more decentralized, competition-driven private sector model, with companies like IBM, Google, Amazon, and IonQ pursuing largely independent roadmaps, competing against each other for both technical breakthroughs and customers. Now, here's the part of this story that rarely gets enough attention because it complicates the simple narrative of two countries racing each other in isolation. Quantum computing depends on it. This vulnerability extends well beyond depend on materials like helium-3, silicon-28, rubidium isotopes, and specialized detector materials, all needed in genuinely tiny quantities, but each with qualification timelines measured in years rather than months, meaning a sudden supply disruption can't simply be solved by scrambling to find an alternate source overnight. Researchers have specifically proposed building a dedicated quantum criticality and critical minerals dashboard, a continuously updated tool designed to track exactly these kinds of concentration risks, refining choke points, and geopolitical stress signals across the entire quantum supply chain in real time. The stakes here genuinely extend beyond ordinary economic competition. Whoever effectively controls these narrow, concentrated supply chains could eventually help decide which nations get meaningful access to the computing power capable of cracking encryption protecting trillions of dollars in global financial transactions and sensitive government secrets. This is exactly why some policy analysts argue America's current funding push, while genuinely significant, still needs to be paired with an equally serious industrial strategy addressing these underlying supply chain vulnerabilities. One recent policy analysis put the challenge in stark, direct terms, arguing that a country determined to win what it calls the defining technological race of the century simply cannot allow its chief rival to control the industrial base that entire race actually depends on. Despite the United States boasting a genuinely world-leading ecosystem of universities and innovative startups, thin and globally dispersed supply chains increasingly constrain American quantum progress in practice, forcing continued reliance on foreign, including Chinese or fragile single-supplier markets for absolutely critical inputs, ranging from precision lasers and cryogenic system S to specialized photonic materials and advanced microfabrication equipment. So who's actually winning this race right now, with all of that context properly considered? The honest answer is that it genuinely depends on which specific metric you choose to measure. China currently holds a meaningful, well-documented lead in quantum communications specifically, built on more than a decade of sustained state investment in satellite-based quantum key distribution and its expansive terrestrial fiber backbone network. The United States, by contrast, maintains a broader, more diverse ecosystem across multiple competing quantum computing pathways simultaneously, driven by genuine private sector competition between companies pursuing meaningfully different technical approaches, rather than a single, centrally coordinated national roadmap. China's computing progress, while genuinely rapid, remains somewhat uneven and difficult to independently verify, since most reported results still lack the kind of independent replication that would satisfy skeptical Western researchers. And Chinese systems still rely fairly heavily on imported, cryogenic, photonic, and control components, despite the country's aggressive self-sufficiency push. Meanwhile, America's own quantum sensing capabilities remain genuinely advanced and diverse, even if the broader national strategy remains considerably less centrally coordinated than Beijing's top-down approach. There's also a broader shift happening in how this entire competition is now being measured, one worth understanding before drawing any confident conclusions about who's actually ahead. For much of the past decade, Quantum competition centered almost entirely on laboratory breakthroughs, counting qubits, measuring coherence times, and celebrating individual demonstrations of theoretical quantum advantage. But as these technologies move closer to genuine operational use across communications, sensing, optimization, and cryptographic resilience, the real competition is shifting toward something analysts increasingly call an infrastructure phase. The critical question is no longer simply who invents a given breakthrough first, but rather who can actually build, govern, and scale the infrastructure through which these quantum systems will genuinely operate at national scale. In this emerging phase, real advantage accrues less to whichever country claims the fastest individual innovation, and more to whichever nation successfully embeds smart governance choices directly into its supply chains, technical standards, procurement systems, and security frameworks. That reframing matters enormously for how we should actually interpret America's $2 billion announcement and China's immediate market reaction to it. This wasn't simply a story about which country builds the better quantum chip first. It's a story about which country can successfully translate genuine scientific capability into deployable, scalable, secure national infrastructure before its rival manages to do exactly the same thing. Both countries clearly understand the stakes involved here. Both are pouring unprecedented amounts of capital into the race simultaneously. And based on how violently markets reacted within just 48 hours of America's announcement, both sides also understand that this particular race is nowhere close to being finished, no matter how many individual milestones either country manages to claim along the way. There's also a harvest now, decrypt later dimension threading through this entire competition that makes the stakes feel even more urgent than a simple race for bragging rights. Both nations understand that whichever side achieves fault-tolerant quantum computing first could potentially unlock encrypted data that adversaries have been quietly intercepting and storing for years, waiting patiently for exactly this moment to arrive. That reality compresses the policy timeline dramatically, forcing governments and critical infrastructure operators to modernize their cryptographic systems before fault-tolerant quantum computers actually emerge, rather than waiting until the threat becomes undeniable. Migrating national-scale digital infrastructure toward quantum-resistant encryption demands coordinated procurement cycles, new technical standards, and large-scale implementation across legacy systems that have been running unchanged for decades. Whichever nation manages that transition most effectively, rather than simply building the most impressive quantum computer first, may ultimately hold the more durable strategic advantage. So did America's quantum project really shock China, or did it simply confirm what Beijing already suspected was coming eventually? Probably a bit of both. The scale and speed of America's coordinated funding response clearly caught Chinese markets off guard, enough to trigger an immediate, visible reaction across multiple publicly traded companies within days. But China's own 5-year strategic planning, already placing quantum technology at the very top of its national priority list well before this announcement ever happened, suggests Beijing had already been positioning itself for exactly this kind of escalation for years. What America's move genuinely did was compress an already tense timeline even further, forcing both nations to accelerate spending, coordination, and deployment simultaneously, rather than allowing either side the luxury of a slower, more measured approach to a technology race that increasingly looks like it will help define global power for decades to come. If this breakdown helped you understand what's really happening beneath the headlines in the US-China quantum race, make sure to subscribe so you catch the next deep dive the moment it drops, and leave a like if you think more people need to see exactly how high the stakes in this rivalry have already become. Because whatever happens next in this race, one thing is already completely clear. Neither Washington nor Beijing is treating quantum technology as some distant, someday concern anymore. Both are treating it as a battle actively being fought and funded right now in real time, with genuinely enormous consequences riding on who ultimately comes out ahead, and with global capital markets already reacting to every single move either side makes along the way. The next headline in this race probably isn't far off, and if history is any guide, markets on both sides of the Pacific will feel it within hours of it breaking.